Apple is the most profitable company in the history of human commerce. Not because it makes the best phones, but because it makes the most obedient customers. Every year, hundreds of millions of people line up to spend more money on a device they already own a version of. They upgrade voluntarily, they upgrade eagerly, and they do it without Apple ever asking them to. No other company in the world has built that kind of behavioral compliance at scale. No other brand has engineered loyalty so deep that the customer does the selling for them. And that is exactly what we are breaking down today. For most of the 20th century, the way companies competed was simple. You built a better product, priced it lower than your competitor, and let the market decide. Volume was the game, margins were thin. The winner was whoever could move the most units. Apple broke that logic entirely. By 2024, Apple's gross margin on its products sat above 40%. For context, the average consumer electronics company operates at margins between 5 and 15%. Apple is not competing on price. Apple is not even competing on specifications. In most measurable technical comparisons, camera resolution, processing benchmarks, battery life, Apple's flagship iPhone performs comparably to high-end Android devices that cost $400 less. And yet the iPhone remains the best-selling smartphone on the planet in its price category year after year. What changed is not the product. What changed is the game Apple is playing. The shift that Apple recognized, and that most companies still do not fully understand, is that in a world of abundant choice, the scarcest resource is not product quality. It is customer attention, trust, and identity alignment. Apple stopped competing for your dollar. It started competing for your sense of self. This is the new economics of premium brands in the digital age. The companies generating the most wealth are not always the ones with the best technology. They are the ones that have made their product feel like a statement of who you are, not just what you own. Apple understood this before most of Silicon Valley, and they built their entire business model around it. To understand how Apple actually generates its wealth, you need to look past the hardware and into the architecture they have built beneath it. Apple's revenue breaks into two primary engines. The first is product sales, iPhones, Macs, iPads, Apple Watch, AirPods. The second, and increasingly more important, is services, the App Store, iCloud, Apple Music, Apple TV Plus, Apple Pay, Apple Arcade, and a growing portfolio of subscription products. In 2023, Apple's services division generated over $85 billion in revenue. That number is staggering on its own, but what matters more than the number is the margin. Apple's hardware carries a gross margin of around 37%. Their services business carries a gross margin of over 70%. Services are nearly twice as profitable per dollar as the physical products Apple is famous for. This is not a coincidence. It is a design decision made decades in advance. Every time Apple sells you an iPhone, it does not just sell you a device. It sells you an entry point into a closed ecosystem, a digital environment where Apple controls the App Store, the payment rails, the streaming platform, the cloud storage, and increasingly the financial infrastructure. Once you are inside that ecosystem, switching costs become enormous. Your photos are in iCloud. Your subscriptions are tied to your Apple ID. Your apps are not transferable to Android. Your contacts, your messages, your health data, all of it lives inside Apple's architecture. This is what economists call a platform lock-in model. And Apple has executed it more successfully than any company in history. The hardware is not the product, the hardware is the door. The ecosystem is the product. Here is the part that most analyses of Apple miss entirely. Apple's most valuable asset is not its technology. It is not its supply chain. It is not even its brand. It is the emotional cost of leaving. Apple has engineered a psychological environment where switching away from their products does not feel like a practical decision. It feels like a loss of identity. Research in behavioral economics consistently shows that people weigh losses more heavily than equivalent gains. Apple has turned the act of staying in their ecosystem into loss aversion by design. When you switch from iPhone to Android, you lose your iMessage blue bubbles. That sounds trivial, but in the United States specifically, where iMessage is dominant among younger demographics, being a green bubble carries a genuine social cost. Studies have shown that young Americans actively avoid dating people with Android phones, not because of the technology, but because of the social signal. Apple did not create this phenomenon by accident. They created it by building communication infrastructure that privileges their own users, and then letting social pressure do the rest. That is not engineering, that is behavioral architecture. Most people look at a premium-priced product and ask, is it worth the cost? That is the wrong question. The people who build wealth, whether at the corporate level or the personal level, ask a different question. They ask, what does this product make the customer feel, and how durable is that feeling? Apple's genius is not that it makes people feel wealthy. It makes people feel like they belong to a tribe of people who value quality, creativity, and design. It makes ownership feel like a values statement. The average consumer buys a product. Apple's customer buys a membership. This psychological distinction is the foundation of every ultra-premium brand in the world, from Rolex to Louis Vuitton to Ferrari. But Apple has achieved something none of those brands have. It has made premium pricing aspirationally accessible. A Rolex costs thousands of dollars. An iPhone costs $1,000. That is still expensive by absolute standards, but it is achievable for a much wider population. Apple sits at the precise intersection of aspirational and attainable. The companies and individuals losing ground economically in this environment are the ones still competing on features and price. They are playing a game where the margin is always thin and the customer has no loyalty. One cheaper competitor emerges, and the customer leaves without hesitation. The winners are the ones who have built emotional infrastructure around their product or service. When your customer associates what you offer with a version of themselves they want to be, a more creative person, a more sophisticated person, a more productive person, price becomes a secondary consideration. Apple has done this at a scale no company has replicated, but the principle is not unique to trillion-dollar corporations. It applies equally to independent brands, service businesses, and individual professionals building their reputation. The question is not how do I compete on price. The question is how do I become the brand that my customer cannot imagine leaving. In 2001, Apple was not a dominant company. It was a niche computer manufacturer with a loyal but small customer base, trading at a fraction of its current valuation. Steve Jobs had returned to the company 4 years earlier, after his removal in 1985, and he was making a series of decisions that looked, from the outside, like expensive gambles. The iPod launched in October 2001, not as Apple's most technically advanced product, but as a cultural object. The marketing did not say it had 20 gigabytes of storage. It said it put 1,000 songs in your pocket. The technical specification became an emotional statement. The iPod was not the first MP3 player. Creative Technology had one, Rio had one. Several better spec'd alternatives existed on the market. But Apple understood that in consumer electronics, the winner is rarely the one with the best specifications. The winner is the one who makes the customer feel something. The iPod outsold every competitor not because of its storage capacity, but because of its design, its simplicity, and the story Apple wrapped around it. Then came iTunes. Apple's music store launched in 2003 and changed the industry permanently. For the first time, consumers could legally purchase a single song for 99 cents. The music industry initially saw this as a threat. In retrospect, it was the moment Apple established itself as a digital commerce infrastructure company, not just a hardware maker. Every song you bought on iTunes was tied to your Apple account. That was the ecosystem beginning to form. But here is what almost derailed everything. In 2007, when Steve Jobs announced the original iPhone, the device ran a closed operating system with no third-party applications. Jobs initially believed that Safari web apps would be sufficient for developers. He was wrong. Developers revolted. The technology press was skeptical. Early reviewers noted that for all its beauty, the original iPhone had fewer practical functions than the smartphones it was competing with. Apple's response was not to defend the decision. It was to build the App Store, which launched in 2008. And what happened next was not something Apple fully controlled. It was something Apple enabled. Third-party developers flooded the platform. In the first year alone, they submitted tens of thousands of applications. Apple's closed ecosystem, which had been criticized as a limitation, became its greatest competitive advantage. Because Apple controlled the distribution channel for every application on the iPhone, it controlled the economics of an entirely new software marketplace. Today, Apple collects between 15 and 30% of every transaction processed through the App Store. It does not build most of those applications. It does not fund them. It simply operates the infrastructure through which they are sold and takes a cut of every single transaction forever. The very feature critics said would kill the iPhone became the mechanism that turned Apple into the most profitable company on earth. Apple's strategy is worth studying not because most people will build a trillion-dollar company, but because the principles behind its success are fully portable to individual scale. The first principle is this: own the infrastructure, not just the product. Apple does not just sell phones. It owns the platform through which applications are distributed, payments are processed, content is streamed, and data is stored. The phone is almost incidental. What Apple monetizes is the relationship between millions of developers, millions of consumers, and the platform that connects them. At an individual level, this translates directly. A freelancer who works through a client's platform is renting access to someone else's infrastructure. A creator who builds their audience entirely on one social media platform is one algorithm change away from irrelevance. But a professional who owns their email list, their domain, their subscriber relationship, that person has infrastructure. They have a direct channel that no platform can revoke. The second principle is that switching costs are a strategy, not a side effect. Apple intentionally makes leaving expensive. It does this through iCloud, through iMessage, through the seamless integration between devices. Every time a customer buys another Apple product, the switching cost increases. The ecosystem grows more valuable to the individual and more costly to abandon. For anyone building a personal brand, a service business, or any professional identity, the question worth asking is, what makes it difficult for my clients or my audience to leave? Not through contracts or artificial barriers, but through genuine value accumulation. The more value you deposit into a relationship over time, the harder it becomes to walk away from. Apple calls this customer retention. At the personal level, it is simply the art of becoming indispensable. There is a concept in business strategy called the flywheel. It was popularized by the management theorist Jim Collins, and it describes the way that certain businesses build compounding momentum, where each action reinforces the next and the system becomes progressively more powerful over time. Apple's flywheel looks like this. More iPhone sales mean more users enter the ecosystem. More users in the ecosystem attract more developers to the App Store. More applications on the App Store make the iPhone more valuable to new customers. More valuable iPhones drive more sales. And Apple collects revenue at every rotation of the wheel. This is not just a business model, it is a wealth compounding machine. And once a flywheel reaches a certain velocity, it becomes almost impossible for a competitor to disrupt from the outside. This is why Apple's cash reserves have at various points exceeded $200 billion. A company with that much liquidity does not just generate profit, it uses that profit to buy back its own shares, which concentrates ownership, increases earnings per share, and drives the stock price higher. Between 2013 and 2023, Apple repurchased more than $600 billion of its own stock. That is the largest corporate stock buyback in history. Apple's shareholders have not just benefited from a successful product company. They have benefited from a systematic, decades-long program of capital return, engineered by a management team that understood the relationship between cash generation, capital allocation, and shareholder value at a level most companies never approach. The insight here is not that Apple is uniquely talented. The insight is that Apple is uniquely disciplined about what it does with its advantages once it earns them. Most companies that generate excess cash spend it on acquisitions that dilute value. Apple spent it on itself, and in doing so, created more value per share than almost any buyback program in financial history. This is the part of Apple's story that the business press rarely tells. It is not just a product company. It is one of the most sophisticated capital allocation machines ever built, and it operates behind a very attractive logo. Now here is the question that should challenge everything you think you know about Apple's dominance. Can it last? Apple's services revenue depends on the App Store, and the App Store is under legal and regulatory attack on multiple fronts simultaneously. The European Union's Digital Markets Act has already forced Apple to allow third-party app stores in Europe. The United States Department of Justice filed a landmark antitrust lawsuit against Apple in 2024, targeting the exact ecosystem monopoly practices we have been describing. If Apple loses control of its app distribution infrastructure, if governments force it to open its platform to competitors, the 30% commission it collects on every transaction evaporates, and with it, the highest margin engine of its business model. Apple's greatest strength and its greatest regulatory vulnerability are the same thing: the closed ecosystem. This is not a reason to doubt Apple's long-term position, but it is a reminder that no business model operates in a vacuum. The rules of the game can change, and the companies that survive those changes are the ones that have built real value for their customers, not just structural dependency. Apple has both. The question is, which one proves more durable? Apple did not build the most profitable company in human history by making the best phone. It built the most profitable company in human history by making the most expensive decision to leave. Every element of Apple's strategy, the ecosystem, the App Store, the services revenue, the capital buybacks, the emotional branding, points back to a single foundational insight. Value is not what you put into a product. Value is what the customer would lose by walking away from it. That is the real Apple business model, not a device, not an operating system. A relationship engineered to be worth more than anything a competitor can offer. The companies and individuals who internalize that lesson, who build genuine, compounding, irreplaceable value in the relationships they maintain, those are the ones that will still be relevant a decade from now. Apple has spent 50 years proving that point. The evidence is in your pocket. If this breakdown gave you a sharper lens on how real business value is built, subscribe to Business and Money Secrets. Every episode is designed to give you the kind of financial intelligence that most people never get access to.